Stop. Freeze the frame right here. Forget everything you thought you knew about medieval life. You picture kings in castles, knights in shining armor, great feasts in grand halls. But I'm about to pull back the curtain on the most dangerous, most fundamentally terrifying secret of the 14th century. A disaster so insidious, it masqueraded as the ultimate comfort. Can you believe that for hundreds of years, the very act of survival, the desperate need to escape the paralyzing, bone-shattering cold of a German winter, was achieved through a terrifying, slow-motion suicide pact? This isn't just history. This is the story of how half of Europe accidentally trapped itself in a perpetual toxic haze. Welcome to the year 1300 CE, deep in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, where the air you breathed was quite literally trying to kill you. The sun has set, the brutal winds howl outside, and inside the sturdy timber frames and wattle and daub walls of your home, a single life-giving fire crackles. It is the only thing standing between your family and a frozen demise. But there is no chimney. Read that again. No chimney. The brilliant architectural solution we take for granted today, that simple vertical shaft leading deadly exhaust safely away from human lungs, it simply hasn't been widely adopted yet. It is the missing piece of the puzzle, and its absence is a silent catastrophe no one saw coming, even as they choked on it daily.
This is the era of the Rauchhaus, the smokehouse, or perhaps more accurately, the death trap dwelling. The fire is built directly on a central hearth, sometimes just a pile of stones, and the rising smoke has nowhere to go but up, and then, horrifically, back down into the living space.
It is a perverse, terrifying feedback loop. The smoke, thick and oily, rises until it hits the low ceiling, where it stagnates. It blankets the room, holding the precious, life-saving heat prisoner. The warmth is trapped, yes, but so are the poisons. Every breath taken inside that room is a commitment to a shorter life.
Imagine waking up every single morning with lungs burning, eyes watering, the taste of soot permanently etched onto your tongue. The furniture, the food, the very clothes on your back, everything is coated in a thick, black, greasy layer of carbon. This wasn't just aesthetic damage. This was a deep, fundamental assault on the human body. The air inside these homes was a chemical soup. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer that steals your oxygen while you sleep, was rampant. Soot, particulate matter, the medical consequences were apocalyptic. We are talking about chronic respiratory failure on a mass, generational scale, disguised simply as winter coughs or the old sickness. Think about the children. They grew up in this perpetual toxic twilight. Their immune systems were constantly under siege, their development hampered by the lack of clean air. This smoky environment wasn't a temporary inconvenience. It was the baseline reality of existence for the vast majority of peasants laborers, and even moderately successful merchants across Central Europe. The irony is gut-wrenching. They were masters of stonework, capable of constructing soaring cathedrals that kissed the clouds, structures of unbelievable complexity and beauty. Yet they couldn't figure out the simplest, most essential piece of domestic engineering: how to vent a fire safely. They tried methods, of course. They would drill small holes near the roofline, tiny, inadequate escape routes known as smoke vents or Rauchloch. But these were a compromise, not a solution. They only allowed a tiny fraction of the acrid fog to escape, and worse, they let in the very cold they were trying so desperately to fight. It was a choice between freezing to death quickly outside or slowly suffocating inside, warm but poisoned. The smoke was the guardian of the heat, and thus the guardian of life itself. To vent the smoke was to invite the cold to reclaim the home, rendering the fire useless. This was the deadly paradox that defined life in medieval Germany. And this wasn't just happening in ramshackle huts. Even the hulls of minor nobles and the kitchens that served the great fortresses were often choked with this same suffocating haze. The status symbol wasn't a clean, clear room. The status symbol was simply surviving the winter, no matter the cost to your health. The smoke was so dense, so inescapable, that it fundamentally changed the very texture of life. It dictated what people wore, how they cooked, and even how often they could bathe, which was rarely, because smoke helped preserve things, including the grime on your skin. But here is where the story gets even darker. This toxic haze didn't just affect the lungs, it fueled the rampant spread of fire. Imagine a thick layer of flammable soot coating every wooden beam, every thatched roof. A minor spark, a sudden gust of wind down the inadequate vent, and boom, the entire village could vanish in minutes. We must understand this fundamental truth. The warmth they craved was a ticking time bomb. It was a trade-off that cost generations their health and their homes. And the only people who were safe, who lived in airy, clean environments, were those at the very pinnacle of power. And even their safe spaces were hard-won and rare. How did they cope with this constant assault? What strange superstitions and religious beliefs developed around the necessity of this life-giving yet deadly smoke? And who, finally, was the forgotten architectural genius who dared to challenge the ancient traditions and invent the true solution, the glorious, life-saving chimney? Prepare yourself. This is the history of the air we breathe and the silent war fought inside every medieval home. The battleground was not a muddy field outside the city walls. It was the heart of the home, the very place consecrated to warmth and family. This was the Stube, the living chamber of 14th century Germany, and it was a death trap disguised as salvation. When the brutal chill of the Germanic winter descended, the citizens of Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Köln faced an impossible choice: freeze outside the hearth's circle, or be slowly poisoned within its suffocating embrace. The enemy was invisible, odorless, and yet it claimed more lives than any roaming band of highwaymen or foreign plague. We are talking about the sheer, terrifying necessity of the smoke itself. In this era, the fire was built directly on the stone floor or within a crude, stone-lined pit, the Feuerstelle. There was no vertical escape route for the noxious gases because every scrap of heat, every molecule of thermal energy had to be trapped inside the thick walls and low ceilings of the dwelling.
The smoke was not a nuisance. It was insulation. It was a dense, protective blanket meant to hold back the icy breath of the North Sea winds. But in performing its duty, the smoke gave birth to the silent executioner, carbon monoxide, CO, the specter that stalked the sleep of the medieval peasant.
Imagine waking with a headache so crushing it feels like the skull is splitting in two. Imagine the constant, dull lethargy that was simply accepted as the condition of winter life. Not fatigue from labor, but the slow, persistent poisoning of the bloodstream. Doctors, those who dared to call themselves such, had no name for this affliction. They attributed the winter deaths to bad humors or damp spirits. They failed to understand that the very air their patients breathed was biologically hostile, a toxic soup brewed from incomplete combustion. The process of building a fire in a room with no chimney led to a terrifying architectural phenomenon, the Rauchstube, or smoke room. These rooms were perpetually stained black, the massive beams overhead glistening with accumulated tar and soot, a petroleum residue known as ruß. This isn't just cosmetic dirt. This blackening was the physical embodiment of the poison, flaking off the walls and mixing with the dust, coating every piece of bread and every thread of wool. The sheer density of the particulates meant that the inhabitants were breathing not just CO, but a constant blizzard of carcinogenic ash. To survive, these homes relied on primitive, barely adequate ventilation methods. Sometimes a tiny high window or a single small aperture, a Luftloch, was carved near the eaves, designed not to draw the smoke out, but merely to allow the most superheated, buoyant portion of the smoke cloud to dissipate gradually into the attic space. It was a desperate compromise. If the hole was too large, the precious heat escaped. If it was too small, the CO concentration reached fatal levels within hours of banking the fire for the night. The balancing act was an agonizing nightly ritual, a whispered prayer against the coming darkness and its invisible threat. And the darkness was particularly cruel to the most vulnerable. Infant mortality spiked dramatically in the winter months. A baby, sleeping low to the floor where the dense, oxygen-depleted air settled, might simply fail to wake, embraced by death's gentle lullaby of warmth and drowsiness. The medieval mind, steeped in tradition, had perfected the technique of the Rauchstube, the smoke outflow. But this outflow was always horizontal and diffused, never the concentrated vertical draw we recognize today. They understood that smoke rises, but they refused to acknowledge the engineering leap required to harness that physics safely. The challenge was psychological as much as physical. Fire represented life, protection, and civilization. The thought of losing even a fraction of that life-giving heat to a massive hole in the ceiling was anathema, a waste that could spell the difference between survival and starvation when spring was still weeks away. This necessity fueled the development of the Kachelofen, the famous tiled stove. Born out of the desire to extract maximum heat from minimum fuel, these massive, ceramic-clad ovens stored heat incredibly well. But initially, even these complex structures were vented into the room, requiring the family to constantly adjust air intake to prevent instant suffocation. They had sophisticated stoves, but primitive exhaust. The people were living in the twilight of heating technology, brilliant in efficiency, but catastrophic in environmental safety. The solution was literally hovering above their heads, waiting for an architect brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to challenge the 1,000-year reign of the smoke-filled room. The realization had to dawn. True warmth doesn't mean trapping the smoke. True warmth means mastering the smoke, sending it away while stealing its heat. This required a revolutionary understanding of draft and vacuum, of how to turn the air itself into a controlled, powerful force that would pull the poison out of the family's world. The architectural evolution had stalled, held captive by the fear of cold. But soon, the sheer unsustainable death toll, the constant, sickening fog of the Rauchstube, would force the hand of innovation. The silent catastrophe was about to meet its nemesis, an invention that would redefine the interior world, cleanse the air, and permanently sever the deadly relationship between warmth and suffocation. The chimney was coming, and it would tear a hole through the ceiling of medieval Europe forever. The promise of salvation hung heavy in the perpetually poisoned air, but the road from the suffocating Rauchhaus to a breath of clean air was paved with failed experiments and the ashes of countless near misses. Medieval Germany was desperate for warmth, yes, but it was equally desperate for a design that wouldn't force its inhabitants to dance with the silent killer every single night. The genius of the true chimney, the engineered void that would pierce the dome of the toxic atmosphere, was not a sudden lightning bolt of inspiration, but a slow, agonizing evolution, born from trial and catastrophic error. The earliest attempts were pathetic, almost insulting failures. People, recognizing the problem, simply punched a small hole, a smoke outlet or lock, through the roof or the upper wall, often right above the hearth. This rudimentary venting was less a solution and more a cruel joke played by the laws of physics, because smoke, heavy with particulates and fighting the cold pressure outside, mostly refused to cooperate. instead banking down and swirling back into the living space with malevolent intent. The result was a house that was marginally less toxic than the full Rauch house, perhaps, but certainly not safe. It merely delayed the agony, trapping the highly poisonous carbon monoxide, which is odorless and colorless, allowing it to slowly seep into the lungs of the sleeping family, rendering them lethargic, prone to chronic illness. Architects, or rather the master masons who served the emerging merchant class and the powerful church, began to understand that the solution required more than a simple hole. It required a directed, vertical vacuum, a powerful draft. This was the moment the true engineering challenge began. How do you build a dedicated, fireproof shaft in houses constructed primarily of highly flammable wood and thatch? The immediate answer, and the cause of countless tragedies, was to try to line the wood with clay or stone. But the heat of the fire was immense, cracking the clay, igniting the dry timbers hidden just centimeters away. Entire villages could be reduced to ash because one ambitious farmer dared to introduce a flimsy flue into his otherwise timber-framed home. The risk was so great that for decades, many preferred the known poison of the smoke to the immediate, terrifying threat of a fast-spreading conflagration that would devour everything they owned. The true breakthrough required materials and methods that were still rare and prohibitively expensive for the average peasant. Massive amounts of non-combustible stone, expertly mixed mortar, and the high-level geometric understanding possessed only by specialized guilds. This was not a quick fix. This was a fundamental reconstruction of the built environment, starting with the most powerful institutions. It was in the soaring stone monasteries and the heavily fortified castles of the high nobility, where resources were limitless and masons were bound by oath, that the first truly functional chimneys began to take shape, becoming enormous, imposing structures that were essentially internal stone towers dedicated solely to ventilation. They were monuments to clean air, starkly contrasting the peasant hovels just outside the walls. The key innovation was twofold. First, separating the actual firebox, the hearth, from the vertical flue with a sturdy stone mantelpiece and an arch, ensuring the fire itself was contained at the base. Second, ensuring the flue itself was tall enough and wide enough to maintain a consistent, powerful updraft, literally sucking the dangerous gases up and out of the human environment. This separation was revolutionary. It meant the heat stayed low, warming the room, while the toxic products were forcefully ejected high above the roofline. But even as the technology matured in the hands of the elite, a profound resistance, rooted in centuries of tradition, plagued its adoption among the common people, who still made up the vast majority of the choked population. Smoke, after all, served multiple purposes in the medieval mind. It wasn't just a byproduct. It was a necessary preservative. The smoke-blackened timbers of the roof were believed to resist rot and infestation. Hams and sausages hung in the smoke-filled rafters were cured and kept safe from spoilage. The smoke was a crucial part of the economy and the food supply chain, not just a nuisance. To suggest removing the smoke entirely was, to many, to invite ruin, hunger, and the collapse of their very way of life. The psychological barrier was immense. They were being asked to trade a known, slow death for the unknown perils of rot and starvation. This friction created a deadly delay, prolonging the age of the silent suffocation even after the architectural solution had been perfected in the stone halls of power. The chimney, therefore, was not merely an architectural innovation. It was a declaration of war against tradition and a fundamental realignment of human priorities, placing breathable air above preservation, health above historical habit. It would take decades and the spread of devastating lung plagues that specifically targeted the perpetually weakened populace before the common man finally accepted the terrifying proposition that perhaps for the first time in human history, the inside of his own home should not look like the inside of a smoker's lung. The stonemasons began to descend from the castles, carrying blueprints of salvation, attempting to retrofit the deadly wooden hovels. The cost was exorbitant. The risk of fire during construction was still huge, but the payoff was life itself. The battle for clean air was now moving into the streets, house by house, threatening to rip the ancient, smoke-infused fabric of Europe apart and reconstruct it in an image of safety and survival. The air was a lie. It seemed still, heavy, and deceptively warm, a false comfort constructed against the biting Teutonic cold. But within that heavy silence, a chemical assassin worked with ruthless, unseen efficiency. Carbon monoxide, the ghost of the hearth. Every morning, the horror was tabulated not in visible wounds or blood, but in the horrifyingly peaceful stillness of those who simply failed to wake up. Their faces placid, their bodies cold, victims of a slow, systemic suffocation hidden under the guise of survival. These were not merely accidents of fire. These were casualties of atmosphere, thousands swallowed by the invisible smog engineered by necessity, a civilization prioritizing immediate warmth over life itself. This existential threat demanded a revolutionary answer, a breach in the ancient tradition of the Rauchstube, the smokehouse.
For centuries, the Germanic architectural philosophy had embraced the smoke not as waste, but as a crucial, necessary component. It was a preservative for meat hanging high in the rafters, a rough fumigant against creeping insects, and most importantly, a thick, swirling blanket of insulation that kept the precious heat trapped beneath the roof peak.
The smoke, dense with particulates, creosote, and the invisible toxic gases of incomplete combustion, was deliberately forced to linger, cycling slowly down into the living space, coating everything, furniture, clothes, lungs, in a layer of sticky black velvet, before finally escaping through tiny gable vents, or most often, the perpetually open door. It was brutally effective at trapping BTUs, but it was an utterly lethal proposition for the inhabitants. The constant exposure led not just to chronic respiratory collapse and blindness, but to the nightly roulette of carbon monoxide poisoning, a terror that struck without sound or warning. But as the population densities soared across the burgeoning medieval metropolis, the labyrinthine streets of Nuremberg, the crowded docks of Hamburg, the industrial roar of Cologne, this archaic system became a collective death warrant. You could no longer simply vent your domestic poison into the sky. Your neighbor was too close, breathing your residual toxic plume into his own lungs, magnifying the regional catastrophe. This saturation point triggered the rise of the radicals, the architectural heretics who dared to defy the sacred smoke. These early builders, often shunned as madmen or reckless spenders by their traditionalist peers, were introducing a terrifying new concept: the radical and complete separation of fire from the primary living space. They weren't just poking a crude hole in the roof. They were designing the true, articulated chimney, the sophisticated system of the massive smoke hood, the narrowing flue, and the high-reaching stack that acted as a pressurized siphon, leveraging the stack effect to drag the poisonous air up and decisively out. This structural revolution was astronomically expensive. Good timber was scarce, and the stone construction required for a permanent fireproof hearth and flue system was a staggering investment, often costing more than the entire rest of the dwelling, threatening economic ruin for smaller landholders. The common man, still clinging to the ancient ways, looked upon the relatively clean but noticeably colder homes of the chimney users with profound suspicion and outright hostility. Why waste the invaluable warmth that the smoke provided? Why risk the structural integrity of your ancient timber frame with a dangerous, heavy stone tower jutting into the heavens? Yet the true catalyst for official, draconian intervention wasn't the slow suffocation. That was too subtle, too easily dismissed as natural winter illness or plague. Ironically, the engine of change was the explosive, visible risk of urban fire. That dense, particulate-heavy, sticky smoke coated the ubiquitous thatched roofs and wooden walls, turning entire city blocks into highly flammable tinderboxes, waiting for a single stray ember to ignite the inferno. When fire erupted in the densely packed German cities, it didn't just burn one home, it devoured entire districts in horrifyingly efficient hours, erasing accumulated wealth and industry in blinding flashes of uncontrolled heat. City councils, terrified of complete economic annihilation, began to impose unprecedented, severe ordinances. Building codes, which had previously only focused on property lines and material quality, now acquired a terrifying new mandate: ruthless smoke control. Certain high-heat trades, the public bakers, the busy smiths, the brewers, were forcibly mandated to construct expensive, proper external flues or face the unthinkable penalty of being forced to relocate their essential businesses outside the defensive city walls. This was class warfare, waged through architectural mandate. The wealthy burghers could easily afford the luxurious and clean camine. The poor were structurally locked into the suffocating, deadly embrace of the traditional Rauchhaus, often paying exorbitant and crippling fines if their visible smoke density was deemed a public nuisance that threatened the collective safety of the city. Imagine the sheer, disorienting psychological trauma of moving from a perpetual, comforting haze to a state of relative, sterile clarity. For generations, the acrid, woody smell of wood smoke had been inextricably equated with home, with safety, with warmth, and with survival against the crushing, frigid elements. Suddenly, the house smelled empty. It felt cold in a way that clean air always does. This newly scrubbed air felt alien, a fundamental betrayal of ancestral wisdom and necessity. The architectural transition was often met with fierce resistance and even outright sabotage. Whisper campaigns and dark stories circulated among the peasantry, tales of villagers intentionally blocking newly installed flues with debris, preferring the known, traditional danger of the dark, smoky air to the frightening, sterile clarity of the new, scientifically advanced system. They clung to the deep-seated superstition that the smoke held a spiritual, protective power, acting as a barrier against plague, evil spirits, and the malicious intent of winter itself. To banish the smoke, they feared, was to invite the demons of the freezing wind right into your unprotected living room, exposing the soul of the home. The builders, the brave, clean innovators of the rising stack, were therefore often viewed not as saviors, but as dangerous agents of the ruling elite, cruelly forcing modernity down the throats of the common folk, robbing them of their smoky heritage and their perceived spiritual shield, in the name of a science they couldn't possibly trust or comprehend. The fight for the chimney was not just about architecture. It was a battle against primal fear and ingrained cultural suicide. These were people who saw the dense, acrid smoke as a protective barrier, a shield against the creeping cold, believing the warmth it delivered was a divine, albeit painful, necessity. They had tragically confused the symptom with the cure, embracing the very poison that was slowly, systematically dismantling their bodies from the inside out. But the resistance carried a hideous price tag, paid in the most excruciating currency imaginable: the slow, agonizing erosion of human longevity and the constant, throbbing pain that defined their waking hours. We are talking about a generation where old age was simply the cumulative result of 40 years spent breathing fire, where every morning brought the violent, wet, rattling cough that shook the very foundations of the timber frame. This wasn't merely a mild irritation. This was the silent plague of the German winter, a respiratory catastrophe that medical science of the time could only attribute to demonic possession or a catastrophic imbalance of the four humors. They called it winter consumption, a wasting disease that turned robust farmers into ghost-like shadows by the time they reached their 40s. The reality was far more terrifying because the killer was right there, clinging to the rafters, a fine, microscopic layer of deadly particulate matter. It was the soot, the carbon, the pure, unfiltered essence of combustion, coating the alveolar sacs of every man, woman, and child. Imagine the lungs of a 30-year-old miller, blackened and rigid, choked by decades of wood smoke, a condition modern doctors would instantly diagnose as severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, but which medieval society simply accepted as the fate of those who toiled hard. The common term for this affliction, even then, was the miner's sickness, yet these people had never stepped foot in a mine. Their mine was their own home, their hearth the constant source of their slow-motion execution. And if the lungs were the battlefield, the eyes were the immediate, screaming casualties. Every moment spent inside the Hütte was a negotiation with agonizing inflammation. The smoke sought out the most delicate, exposed tissue, turning the simple act of seeing into a constant, burning agony. Chronic conjunctivitis was endemic. Eyes were perpetually bloodshot, watering constantly, streaming tears that offered a little relief from the abrasive particulate constantly suspended in the air. For many, this relentless exposure led to serious corneal damage and ultimately irreversible blindness long before natural decay set in. The very air inside these structures was a toxic brew, a cocktail of particulate matter combined with the truly invisible executioner, carbon monoxide. This silent, odorless gas was the supreme predator of the German winter, responsible for those terrifying, inexplicable fatalities where seemingly healthy individuals simply failed to wake up after a particularly cold night. These deaths were rarely attributed to the fire. They were often marked down as a sudden stroke of God's will, or perhaps the chilling visitation of a night spirit, a phantom that stole the breath right out of the sleeper's chest. The truth was far more pedestrian and far more sinister. The incomplete combustion of the wood, starved of oxygen in a tightly sealed room, producing a gas that silently bound itself to the hemoglobin, robbing the blood of its life-giving capacity. The symptoms were insidious. The dull, throbbing headache that plagued the village every morning, the persistent dizziness, the profound mental fog that made complex thought nearly impossible. These were not the signs of a poor diet or spiritual weakness, but the chronic, low-level poisoning affecting the entire community's cognitive function. The medieval mind struggled to grasp an enemy it could not see, touch, or smell. The visible smoke was the protective warmth. The invisible killer was simply ignored or supernaturalized. This psychological blindness was the ultimate triumph of the toxic tradition. Furthermore, the very construction of these homes amplified the danger. The daub and wattle walls, sealed tight with clay and manure to prevent heat loss, acted like a massive sponge for toxins. The structure itself became saturated with smoke residues, meaning that even when the fire was low, the walls continued to off-gas volatile organic compounds back into the living space. The timber frames, blackened and sticky with creosote, became reservoirs of poison, ensuring that the inhabitants were never truly breathing clean air, even during the summer months when the hearth was used less frequently. The house was not merely a shelter. It was a slow-roasting oven designed by fear and sealed by tradition. The cycle was brutally efficient. Smoke exposure led to chronic illness. Chronic illness led to diminished capacity for labor, and diminished labor capacity led to poverty, forcing the family back into the exact same smoky, cheap dwellings that perpetuated the death cycle. And yet, the attempts by progressive nobles and increasingly informed urban guilds to mandate the chimney were met with furious, almost violent resistance. The fear was that the chimney would break the spiritual seal of the home, allowing evil spirits to enter, or worse, allowing the precious protective smoke, which they believed warded off illness, to escape entirely.
They were fighting to keep their poison, defending the very thing that made their children cough until their faces turned purple, all in the name of a misguided, tradition-bound survival instinct that defied all logic. The battle was not just against the smoke, but against the sheer, devastating weight of cultural inertia. The next stage of this silent war required something cataclysmic, a moment of undeniable mass tragedy to finally shatter the ancient, deadly allegiance to the smoke-filled room. Until then, the villagers would continue to breathe their doom, believing it was the only thing keeping them alive.
They called it the winter haze, a comforting, heavy blanket that settled over the timber frames and across the rough-spun blankets. But it was no comfort. It was the air itself turning traitor, an atmospheric assassin composed of elements they could not see and therefore could not fear. The thick black patina that coated every structural beam in the great hall was not merely insulation. It was the fossil record of 1,000 nights of slow poisoning, a constant reminder of the deadly bargain they had struck with the elements. This silent killer didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with a persistent, low-grade throb that became the background music of their entire existence. The true predator was odorless, colorless, and utterly silent. Carbon monoxide. This ghost gas possessed an unnerving biological cunning, binding to the hemoglobin in their blood with an affinity 250 times greater than oxygen itself. In every breath taken near the central hearth, life was systematically being replaced by death, molecule by agonizing molecule. This wasn't just feeling tired after a long day of labor. This was the systematic starvation of the brain, the heart, and every vital muscle required for survival. Their blood was slowly being suffocated from the inside out. They woke every morning already exhausted, bodies heavy with a poison hangover that never truly dissipated. Chronic headaches were as common as dawn, dismissed as the necessary pain of existence, the simple consequence of a hard life lived under God's watchful, perhaps indifferent eye. Lethargy became a societal norm, the widespread weakness often attributed to poor diet or the curses of local witches, never the inescapable cloud hovering inches from their sleeping faces. This constant low-level hypoxia guaranteed that the mental fog of medieval life was not metaphorical. It was chemically induced, a permanent impairment of cognitive function caused by the lack of oxygen reaching the frontal lobe. But the visible enemy, the particulate matter, was equally devastating, carving its own slow path to the grave. Picture the inside of their lungs, a battlefield perpetually choked by microscopic shards of burnt wood and vegetable matter. A constant, abrasive assault on the delicate tissues. These tiny fragments of hot soot bypassed the body's defenses, embedding themselves deep within the alveolar sacs, the very sites of gas exchange. Every cough that racked the small bodies of the children, every deep, rasping wheeze that accompanied the elders to their rest, was the unmistakable sound of tissue degrading under constant, abrasive siege. The air they were breathing was chemically corrosive, turning their internal spaces into the consistency of tar. Chronic bronchitis, persistent inflammation, and the rapid onset of what was vaguely termed consumption, often exacerbated tuberculosis, became the terrifying markers of a successful winter. The German medieval physician, clueless in his understanding of pneumatics or toxicology, could only label these rampant respiratory failures as winter sickness or dark omens sent by malevolent spirits, utterly failing to recognize the killer was literally built into the architecture of the home. This deadly environment dictated the very rhythm of their domestic existence. They learned to live low, often sleeping on pallets barely raised from the dirt floor, instinctively seeking the slightly cleaner, cooler air near the ground, as the densest, hottest smoke layered near the ceiling and clung to the rafters.
Their entire physical posture was an adaptation to toxicity, a primal crouch beneath the deadly ceiling. And in a terrifying twist of fate, the poison provided a perverse utility that cemented their devotion to the smoke-filled room.
They even incorporated the smoke into their economic survival. The very air that killed them was also their best preservative, hanging meats, fish, and cheeses high in the smoke-filled rafters, inadvertently curing them and protecting them from insects and the quick rot of a damp winter. This apparent benefit, the meat lasting longer, the insects being driven away, the beams hardened against decay, served only to solidify the fatal cultural belief: smoke is necessary for life, prosperity, and structural integrity. It was a perverse, self-reinforcing lie, trapping them further in the cycle of toxic habitation. Survival was fundamentally linked to the atmosphere that was actively killing them, a cultural paradox wrapped in soot and fear. While the commoners breathed this perpetual fog, a radical, life-altering change was quietly brewing in the stone fortresses of the aristocracy. In the great castles and powerful monasteries, where wealth shielded the elite from the most immediate horrors, the first tentative, experimental flues, primitive, localized chimneys, were beginning to pierce the thick roofs. These early attempts at ventilation were not humanitarian breakthroughs, but architectural necessities. Grand halls and kitchens, designed to feed hundreds,
could not function effectively if the smoke blinded the cook or ruined the expensive imported tapestries. Noble lungs, it seemed, demanded cleaner air for political maneuvering and comfortable feasting, while the peasant remained expendable.
This meant that survival itself was becoming a commodity, a luxury afforded only to the landed elite. The same winter air that offered comfortable respite to the count was for the serf just outside the castle walls, a death sentence delivered nightly by the very fire meant to save them. The vast majority, the common man, remained locked in the Hall house, the single-room dwelling, where the entire family, sometimes the livestock too, shared the same finite, rapidly depleting supply of breathable air, sealed in by their desperate need for warmth. The statistics, if they could have been calculated, would have been staggering. Lifespans dramatically shortened by perhaps a decade. Infant mortality rates skyrocketing during the cold months, all linked inextricably to the air quality inside their most sacred sanctuary, the home. They lived in a continuous state of hypoxia and poisoning. Normalized suffering woven into the fabric of daily life, believing their persistent weakness was merely the burden of mortal existence. The only thing that could save them was not a miracle, but a simple architectural innovation. A vertical shaft of stone and mortar, designed to defy gravity and vent the curse skyward. The chimney was coming, but for now, in 1300 CE Germany, the air remained heavy, poisonous, and waiting to claim its next victim, while the villagers, unaware they were participants in their own slow execution, simply stoked the fire higher. The silence that followed the deep winter night was not the peace of slumber, but the terrifying quiet of a slow biological shutdown. They called it the winter torpor, the heavy, suffocating sleep that claimed the oldest and the youngest first, a deep, unnerving coma mistaken for rest. Opening that lid was a declaration of war against the cold. A rush of frigid, bone-chilling air would immediately cascade downward, shattering the hard-won thermal layer near the floor, where the family slept, making the immediate vicinity unbearable and threatening instant respiratory shock. It was the ultimate, agonizing choice, repeated nightly. Suffer the slow, warm asphyxiation of the black fog, which promised unconscious oblivion, or endure the instantaneous, stabbing agony of frostbite and hypothermia to clear the air for just a fleeting, painful moment. They lived in the constant, dreadful oscillation between these two modes of suffering, never truly safe. This relentless, visible decay instilled a deep psychological trauma within the household. The medieval German farmer or artisan was literally living inside the exhaust pipe of their own survival mechanism. The blackness was not just physical, it was moralized, a constant reminder of inescapable dirt and decay. Cleanliness became an impossible, mythic standard, forever unattainable when the very structure of your dwelling was actively generating filth with every hour of warmth provided. The women of the house, battling the soot that ruined clothes and spoiled food, were engaged in a Sisyphean battle against the environment itself, scrubbing surfaces only for the next night's fire to undo their entire day's labor in a matter of hours. They learned to associate the warm, cozy interior with a permanent state of grime, creating a primal disconnect between comfort and purity. The soot stained their hands, their faces, and eventually their memory, becoming inextricably linked to the trauma of winter survival. It was a visible badge of their poisonous existence, impossible to shed until spring, and even then, the residual stain was a permanent scar on the village walls. Beyond the immediate toxicity, the heavy buildup of creosote, that thick, sticky, tarry residue derived from wood smoke and steam, turned the interior into a highly volatile accelerant. The structural timbers were not just wood anymore. They were fuel, saturated with flammable oils. The atmosphere inside the German homes of 1300 CE was not merely stagnant. It was an active, corrosive agent of decay, a suffocating villain that marked its victims not just in the lungs, but on the very walls and beams of their temporary, toxic refuge. The smoke-filled room was the ultimate, necessary, and fatal paradox, demanding everything of its desperate inhabitants.